brief introductory purposes, if you don't know who Dennis Ross is, you haven't been paying attention to U.S. policy since the late 1980s. He really doesn't need an introduction, but he has served in a variety of most senior government positions since the late 1980s. And not only is he a policymaker, he's also a scholar. He's written a large number of books, the most recent one of which is here, and you're welcome to take one on your way out. Directly to my right is Norman Roule. If you know who Norman Roule is, someone needs to be arrested. Norman Roule is not supposed to be known to anybody. He's held a number of senior positions in the intelligence community over a long and, from what I've been told, storied career. And all the way on my right is Ambassador Lana Nusseibeh, the permanent representative of the United Arab Emirates to the United Nations. Welcome to you all here. Let me start out with you, Dennis. You wrote a piece in The Hill the other day in which you argued that the president's aversion to allies is making us less safe in the world. The president and his allies would say, this is the kind of truths that the foreign policy establishment has told itself over and over again. But if you look at it, NATO allies are paying more towards their defense because the president has been hectoring them. U.S. service men and women are no longer in harm's way in places like Syria. They're on their way out in Afghanistan. So why is it so bad that the president is, being tough with America's allies?
The question is not whether he's tough with Americans' allies. The question is there a larger strategy there? Is the strategy something that actually makes the world more or less stable? And is he positioning us in a way where we have not only hard power but soft power so that we can attract others? I think the answer on all three of those is no. And the concern I have is that the basic approach that the president has reflects, to be fair, a school that did exist in American foreign policy historically. It was known as belligerent isolationism. It was really more appropriate to call it belligerent unilateralism. It's a posture that didn't believe in alliances because alliances basically imposed obligation. It didn't want to be hamstrung by values because, your friends can come and go, and if you're really tied to someone else on the basis of values, that has to be more enduring. Those are basically his instincts, and the problem is when he says we shouldn't be the world's policeman, he's right. But if you don't want to be the world's policeman, then you actually have to have allies who will go out on a limb for you, allies who, when you state an objective, because they're attracted to you, they'll line up with your objective, local partners who are prepared to fight for themselves and have the credibility to do so, and if you look at the behavior with the Kurds recently, the message to everybody else is, don't even think about signing up with this president or this administration because they will certainly cut you off. I would just say, as a general principle, American foreign policy should be oriented not just towards involvement in the world, it should be geared towards ensuring that vacuums don't occur. Nature abhors a vacuum, and the worst forces always fill it. And when that's the case, sooner or later, those forces that fill it, sooner or later, they will present a more direct threat to us. Only then, our options for dealing with that threat will be worse, and the cost of dealing with it will also be higher. So my concern about the president is that when you berate your allies and when you betray your partners, you'll have neither.
Let me push you on that one second. I think the debate in Washington has been not so much about staying or going in Syria, but how to leave Syria. What would have been, if you agree with that, what would have been the best way to leave Syria rather than allow the Turks, the Russians, and the Assad regime, and the Iranians to fill a vacuum?
It's a really fair question, although the premise is if we're leaving. When you have a presence of 1,000 and you have a local partner who basically is managing, in a sense, also your needs to ensure ISIS doesn't reemerge, is also making sure that the Iranians and the Syrian regime doesn't come back in there, you're actually serving your longer-term interests. At a minimum, what you should have done is use your presence as a lever. Okay, you don't want us here. Certainly, Putin didn't want us there. Erdogan seems to blow hot and cold on whether we're there. But the answer to that would have been to say, all right, here's what has to happen for us to leave. If it doesn't happen, we're going to stay. So I would have understood it if we were bearing a terrible cost. We weren't. This was very manageable precisely the way it was. And if you're going to give it up, get something for it. This is one of the things I have to say as someone who's a long-time negotiator. You know, I get leverage. What I don't get is surrendering the leverage and getting nothing for it.
Understood. Norm, keeping it within the realm of shoulda, coulda, woulda, this has been a long and difficult summer in the Gulf. Iran has mined tankers, has interfered with shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, has taken tankers essentially hostage, shot down an American drone, and capped all off with an attack on two of the most important crude processing facilities in the world. And everybody shrugged it off. The president announced that he was going to sanction people who have no assets in the United States and never traveled to the United States. And the markets shrugged it off. This is not at all what we would expect. Now, you, through a long career in the intel community, have access to all kinds of information. So can you please make sense of the fact that the markets didn't react and the United States didn't react to what has been things that the Iranians have done that previous administrations have said were, I hate to use the term, but red lines for American military action? What's going on?
It's a great question. So let's take that apart. I think to begin, I would say that the Trump administration in many ways is following the policies of President Obama and President Bush. Avoid a conflict in the region, work with often unenthusiastic European allies and a United Nations Security Council which is not willing to do much to push back, and at the same time enable allies to defend themselves without providing the type of material that would provoke, say, a missile race in the region, et cetera, et cetera. Now, in general, that's not a bad thing. The problem is the Iranians are playing a very different type of game now than the United States. We're playing in many ways a long game. Long-term sanctions, which we know will erode political stability in Iran because of the economic strain it will place on the regime. And if you're a president, you really have about three options. And this is somewhat crude, Dennis, but I think you'll agree. You have diplomacy, economic pressure, or military conflict. Now, if anyone thinks a démarche will get the Iranians out of Lebanon, you know, it's not going to work. And a war in Southwest Asia is not popular either. So economic pressure, along with other tools, obviously, is the game you play. Iran is playing a different game. They know that inevitably this will undermine their regime, and that in order for them to succeed, they need sharp pulses to the international energy and commodity markets. So here's my problem with what happened in the summer. It's not that this was entirely new. In 2011, the Iranians attempted to shoot down an American drone flying near Iran, and the Obama administration's response was to pull drones away from Iran itself. We didn't strike back. The Houthis have attempted to attack a variety of vessels from a variety of countries carrying oil shipments for 2 years, to include the USS Mason and Nitz, American warships, and President Obama didn't strike the Houthis at that point. It is no secret Iran is providing weapons in the Gulf to kill members of the GCC. There's no question. The Iranian leaders right now haven't paid a price, and I worry that they don't know what a red line is for the West. Kill 608 Americans in Iraq, you can get away with it. Blow up embassies, you can get away with it. You take American detainees, we'll exchange them for detainees in the United States. And now you have the Iranian foreign minister proposing detainee exchanges, and there are a lot of American dual citizens in the country to exchange. I think what's missing is we have yet to show the Iranians there is a real penalty for their actions. And in part, that's because, as Dennis states, you need allies. One footnote on that. For allies to be relevant, they must be relevant. And if you were to measure the pile of paper of the European Union talking about JCPOA next to the pile of paper of missile shots fired, enabled solely by Iran, against Saudi Arabia, which has, ignoring Saudis for a moment, tens of thousands of Europeans and Americans. That's a unique point in history, where we have 80,000 Americans And our Congress says we're going to cut off aid in a war in Yemen to find that, in part, helps the Saudis find missiles before they're fired against Americans. So I think going back to all of this, my point is if you want to begin a path forward, we really need a bipartisan approach on this, and an approach where we engage allies, but also go to the allies and say, we're not going to talk about this for 3 years. We're going to have to do some real action. If you don't do that, this cycle goes on, and here's your danger. The Iranians conduct a catastrophically successful strike. A missile takes off from Yemen and lands on an aircraft filled with 300 Americans. A ship actually goes down in the Gulf with a major ecological disaster. And at that point, the world is compelled to go into a major conflict. So now is the time to teach the Iranians, you don't want to go any farther because bad things will happen.
So is the implication of what you're saying that when we do finally find our way back to a negotiation with the Iranians, the United States, for having not responded, is going to have a much weaker hand?
Well, certainly the Iranians are going to approach with many demands, to include compensation for the sanctions penalty they've paid thus far. 2 points. First is that the Iranians did not come to the negotiating table in 2013 willing to accept any deal. Sanctions take years to work. They are the equivalent of money problems in a bad relationship. It's the whiskey bottles and lipstick on the collar that causes things to fall apart. Not paying the rent just speeds it up. But when the Iranians do show up at the same time, we have to think what diplomacy means. So I think Dennis would agree I'm in favor of diplomacy. And negotiations mean compromise on each side. What's a compromise you would give on Iran and Yemen? How about Iran and Syria? Iran and Iraq? I mean, these are things that we don't pay for in the United States, but we talk about. But it's not as if Vermont is losing a bit of its sovereignty to the Iranians. So we have to engage our allies, first and foremost, the Emiratis, the Saudis, the Jordanians, the Kuwaitis, to make sure their equities are represented. Because inevitably on a regional solution, we ain't in that region in the same way as the people who live there, who will be surrounded by Hezbollah's various variations of that and Iranian missiles.
Well, speaking of allies...
Feeling better already, right?
Yeah.
Yes. We're this close to victory.
Speaking of allies, Ambassador Nusseibeh, there has been a lot of press reporting in the last few weeks that the United Arab Emirates is looking for ways to de-escalate tensions in the Gulf, specifically, obviously, with Iran. The UAE has determined that it will withdraw its forces from Yemen, and that your government is looking for ways to have a dialogue with the Iranians. 2 questions as a result of this. 3 questions. Is this true? If so, is this a function of Washington's limited response to Iranian provocations over the course of the last 6 months, let's say? And what is it that you're actually hoping to get out of it, given the tough customers that the Iranians are?
Thank you, Stephen, for those 3 easy questions. And thank you to Ambassador Ross and to Norman for taking my talking points and sharing them with you.
The benefit is you get to turn them back into your own.
Absolutely. But
Anytime.
on a serious note, I think I'd like to build on the very critical points that have been made by Ambassador Ross and by Norman. And the first point is essentially where Norman left off. This isn't a binary choice for the UAE and for other countries in the region between JCPOA or war. Those are not the only tools in the toolkit. So I think that's the first premise. I think the media tends to portray it as these 2 choices. The US withdrew from the JCPOA, therefore the only option available to the Trump administration and its regional allies is war. I think the second point really builds on what Ambassador Ross was talking about, which is potentially the building up of a more coherent, clear political strategy that accompanies the pressure. The UAE certainly believes, like other partners in the region, that this maximum pressure campaign is working. It is hurting the Iranian economy. It's hurting the Iranian currency. It's affecting its ability to fund the proxies in the region that have been such a key challenge for countries like ours. And it's making the Iranians act in ways that are provocative regionally, and understandably to some. Having said that, and I think this has always been our first premise, and this goes to your question, the UAE playing the role of trying to find a mediated solution, a political solution, de-escalating, if you like, is not new. I think the UAE has historically, in terms of its foreign policy, always played that role in the region. We don't want war. We don't want it for the over 400 million people of the population of the Middle East. We don't want it for the 1/5 of that population who are youth, who have aspirations for economic stability and social development like anyone else, anywhere else around the world. But we have seen in previous years the shaking, if you like, of the core foundations of what an Arab state system could look like. Is an Arab state system this model, or is it a theocracy? Is it the model offered by the Iranians? Is it a model of proxies around the region carrying out the actions of state parties? Or is it the model that we are focused on in the UAE? And just in September, I'm proud to have been at the announcement of the launch of an Abrahamic family house that will be built in Abu Dhabi in the coming 2 years, of a synagogue, a mosque, and a church in one place in Abu Dhabi. That's the model that the UAE is seeking to protect and uphold. The model that says that the region is richer because of its ethnic diversity and its religious diversity. A region that in the future accepts Israel as part of that regional security structure. A region that welcomes a positive role that could be played by the Iranians if it would like to join that order of stability and peace. But in order for them to do that, in order for Iran to join that regional order, it does need to behave like a rational state actor that abides by international law and accepts what international norms are that we all accept. So we haven't made any pronouncements, other countries have, on recent activity in the region, but let's not make an underestimation of how important the Straits of Hormuz are to global oil supply. They remain important, whatever the administration in this country or other countries decide in terms of strategy in the region. That's up to the administration, and we work with those administrations and we partner with them to pursue our common goals. Having said that, I think that the stability of the region will always have ramifications for the wider world, whether it's a refugee flow from various protracted crises like Syria, whether it's the threat of Al-Qaeda and Daesh in the region, emerging again in places and pockets like Syria where they were held at bay. And I think it's been quite troubling, the recent reports after the Turkish incursion, that Daesh fighters have been reorganizing. And that's not a problem we want to see reoccurring. Those are two fronts, whether it's women's rights, whether it's the growth of entrepreneurship and possibilities for youth aspirations around the world. These are shared values with the United States, and I don't think those fundamentals in the relationship will change with the ebb and flow of various policy decisions. I think the bedrock is quite stable. On Iran specifically, I think that, yes, we are looking to de-escalate tensions in the region. We have always looked to de-escalate tensions in the region. The JCPOA has been over-debated. It's been over-discussed. As you pointed out, Norman, there is a pile of papers this high from the Europeans describing what hasn't been implemented at the JCPOA and what the sanctions relief was supposed to offer the Iranians. I think our message to our European partners is, what can we do? Bridge the gap between Europe and the United States on Iran. There needs to be a much more coherent global policy position, an international community position towards Iran's behavior in the region, towards its missile capability. And those were the two issues that were really missing from the JCPOA that was always a struggle for regional partners to accept. For us, the nuclear program was one piece of it, but Iran's fundings of proxies from Yemen to Syria to Lebanon to Iraq to Gaza was a much bigger piece of that challenge. And the second thing is we do have to deal with its missile capability. I think that's been demonstrated over the past year in its activities in the region. So we do need to deal with those two buckets of issues. How do we do it? The way we do everything. I sit at the United Nations where, for all the criticism that's leveled at it, multilateral negotiation, the Security Council, the efforts of the P5, creating international consensus remains the primary peaceful ways that countries come together and forge a political process, a framework, if you like, for discussion. If it's JCPOA++, that's fine, but we need a political strategy. We do, however, agree with the economic strategy of maximum pressure. And, you know, it's affected us. The UAE economy was very much a part of the Iranian economy. Trade ties between the two countries were over 20 billion in the beginning of 2018, and today, in the first quarter of 2019, they've dropped 90% to 2 billion, according to initial figures. So we've taken some of the hits of these international sanctions, but we've taken them willingly because we believe that Iran needs to come to the table, needs to begin a negotiation, needs to recognize international law in its dealings with regional partners, And if it does those things without setting prerequisites, but if it does those things, I think there is space for talks.
Ambassador, you are an extraordinarily skilled diplomat, and I noticed that you ran over the part of my question that dealt with Yemen, so I'm going to ask you specifically.
That dealt with?
On Yemen.
Yemen.
The UAE is pulling out of Yemen, announced that it was withdrawing from Yemen, but no one quite really understands what it is that the UAE wants in Yemen. There's a lot of speculation about it wants to be the patron of a new southern state in Yemen that will help do its bidding in a variety of ways. What is the end game? This is a civil war in which there are a number of regional powers involved, obviously the Iranians, obviously the Saudis, and the UAE, as well as a number of other members of the coalition. But what interests is getting out serving the UAE, and what is your end game?
Thank you for the question, reminding me. I deal a lot with Yemen at the United Nations from the humanitarian perspective, but obviously it's also been a file that has dominated policy leadership back at home. And I think it's one of those critical files that we all believe very strongly in. The first thing I'd say is that media analysis to date misses certain key parts of our engagement in Yemen over the past year since the Houthi coup, if you like, that overthrew the Yemeni government. And I think that's the primary fact that gets forgotten in the current analysis. The UAE is part of a coalition that, at the request of the legitimate Yemeni government, came into Yemen, which is legal under international law, at the request of a sovereign government, to help stabilize the country and overturn a Houthi coup, a coup of a militia that's backed by Iran in Yemen that essentially took over Sana'a, Aden, and other cities. And I think that decision, when we look back, and 2020 obviously is always useful, the hindsight that it gives policymakers and people in the policy business. I don't think fundamentally today a different decision would have been taken in 2015 had we had the chance to turn back the clock. I don't think a fundamental policy difference would exist in the decision that we took, because at that point, the option was either watch Iran create another Hezbollah on the border with Saudi Arabia, akin to the one that it created and that has dominated Arab politics in Lebanon, and allow a sovereign Yemeni Arab government to be overthrown by a militia, and allow missiles to build up on the border of Saudi Arabia, our key strategic partner and a key strategic partner to much of the world, or go in as part of a coalition and try and stabilize that situation, which is what we did. Underlying that, we have always been a partner with the Yemenis, with the United States in defeating Al-Qaeda and Daesh in Yemen. And I think that's little talked about, but has been quite a successful operation in various parts of Yemen. And that remains a strategic objective. We will always be part of a coalition to resist Al-Qaeda and Daesh re-emerging in Yemen as a significant threat to regional stability, but also global stability. The second thing is obviously maritime security. I think that's a fundamental security objective, and I think it's one that we were certainly very focused on. We didn't want to see militias control maritime chokeholds in that part of the world, and I think that's something that will remain a strategic objective. Where the media analysis gets it wrong is that the UAE, amongst other coalition partners, feels it has a right or a say in how Yemenis decide to govern themselves, and that's really their political process. And I think that the UAE has been steadfast in supporting the UN Special Envoy's process, Martin Griffiths, and I think the UN process is the only umbrella or tent, if you like, broad enough to bring all the players in, and that's what he's doing. But the process is essentially going to be a Yemeni process. The UAE partnership with certain groups in the south was a partnership to defeat terrorism, extremism, Al-Qaeda in the south. It wasn't a partnership that the UAE undertook because it believed in the aspirations of one group of Yemenis over the other. In our advice, and if I'm speaking frankly, in our advice, we have always said to the UN envoy that when you begin this political process, you do need to bring everyone to the table. It is important that every party has a voice at that table. We think that the security agreement that will emerge from that will be more stable, it will be more long-lasting. So I will admit to that. I think we do believe that all parties in Yemen that have legitimate political aspirations have a voice. We are now withdrawing because we think some of those fundamental objectives have been achieved, namely countering al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and safeguarding those operations with partners like the United States. We think that our contribution to maritime security has been stabilized. It's something that we have to keep coming back to. We will not draw down completely, but it has been stabilized. And the third piece, which is the political process, stability of the Yemeni parties, we think now lies very much in the hands of the Saudi Arabians, who are leading, and we commend them for that. Very important peace talks in Jeddah to try and put forward a political process that will bolster the process that is being led by Martin Griffiths. So the only game in town for the UAE is a political game, and we think that, as I said, the United Nations, and maybe that's my bias, is an important factor, an important actor in that discussion, because it has the legitimacy, it has the broad tent. And we'll do what is asked of us from both our Yemeni partners, our Saudi partners, our coalition partners, and the international community to make sure Yemen stabilizes. We've given upward of $5 billion in aid since this conflict started. That contribution isn't going to peter down simply because we're no longer part of operational activity in Yemen. And we were there before in a humanitarian capacity. We will be there afterwards in a humanitarian capacity and in any other way that we're asked to.
Great, thank you. Dennis, I'm going to move us out of the Gulf momentarily. What's going to happen in Israel? Are they going to have a government? Who's going to be the prime minister? And importantly, who ends up in the prime ministry, is that going to make a fundamental difference in terms of the core issues when it comes to the conflict with the Palestinians?
I could give one-word answers on each.
Well, I mean, we are running down a little bit, so if you want to economize.
I'll try to, uncharacteristically, I won't quite economize, but I'll say the following. We will definitely have a government. I do not believe there'll be a third election. Whoever is seen as being responsible for a third election would for sure lose, and everyone in Israel knows that. My guess is, as is often the case when you're negotiating with coalitions, this will go down to the last minute, 1 minute to midnight. The process itself is, Gantz has just, as of last night, Benny Gantz was given the mandate for 28 days. If he cannot put together a government at that time, there's an additional 3-week period where anybody in the Knesset who could put together a government is given a chance, and only then, if that fails, you have an election. I sense that...
So let me just say, I realize you don't believe there's going to be a third election, but if there would be a third election, it wouldn't be held until March of 2020.
The earliest would be March. There's one other factor that's going to influence this whole thing. The Attorney General will, in all likelihood, come out with a decision on whether to indict. Having declared an intent to indict, having then had a hearing for the Prime Minister, he will declare his decision probably by the first week in December. Now that also tends to overlap with this potential time frame. My guess is we're going to end up with a national unity government. I think it will be formed on the basis of the proposal that President Rivlin made, which was a rotation agreement between Likud and Blue-White, where Netanyahu is the one who initially is the prime minister, but he becomes incapacitated if there's an indictment. There is a very high likelihood that there will be an indictment because the Attorney General, Mandelblit, worked on this for a couple of years. Whether it will include bribery, breach of trust, and fraud on all 3 cases, I doubt. I suspect that we may or we may not see bribery as one of the charges, but I suspect we will see fraud and breach of trust. And the real question will be, will Bibi, under those circumstances, having agreed to incapacitation, will in fact he then be incapacitated? My guess is yes. I think we're going to end up with a government that is national unity. Now, the question you asked, which is most interesting, is how will policies change? And I do think we're going to see, A, with a national unity government, there'll be no annexation in the West Bank, which is significant. B, I think that we will we will see a readiness, a public readiness to engage in talks with the Palestinians, not that different from what we've seen now. The real interesting question will be when, assuming I'm right in this scenario, and everybody here, don't bet the mortgage on it. This is Israeli politics, and this is an educated guess. It doesn't mean it's right. But if that scenario turns out to be correct, it does put the Palestinians in an interesting place where with Netanyahu out of the picture, which will literally, if what I'm describing is right, he would be prime minister for a week or two, and then incapacitated, and Gantz would be prime minister. The Palestinians might seize on that to say, okay, with Gantz, we're prepared to come back to the table. So there is a potential of talks. The issue, however, is not, is there going to be talks or are we going to see the deal of the century? There's not going to be a deal of the century. The gap between the two sides is too wide substantively and psychologically. But if you had talks, you could begin to focus on issues of stabilization. You could begin to deal with some of the sources of disbelief that have contributed to a complete absence of trust and even a sense of possibility on the part of both Israelis and Palestinians alike. Very hard to do anything when you're dealing with what becomes a culture of disbelief on both sides. The place to start is to try to change the environment in a way that restores a sense that something could happen. And I think there is a potential for that. As long as we don't raise our expectations too high, you could see change for the better. What I would most like to see, which is in keeping with what's in the book, I don't want to see Israel become one state for two people. If Israel keeps building outside the settlement blocks, you're going to cross a tipping point, in which case you lose the physical ability to separate. I think from an Israeli standpoint, it's not only does that mean the end of what Zionism was supposed to be, which was a Jewish democracy, and also a set of values that made you a light unto the nations, but it also means Palestinians under those circumstances where one state becomes the only thing that's part of the discourse. When that's the case, Palestinians will have a mantra: one person, one vote. And that will resonate here. That will make BDS look like child's play.
On that happy note, Norm,
You've got to ask a question that
few
puts
minutes.
a smile on something.
This is the Middle East. Very, very hard
This is
to
the
do
Middle
that.
East.
Here's the question that I think many people over the course of the last year, 18 months, have been asking themselves about Saudi Arabia. Is it stable? Is it stable? Seems there's a sense in the discourse about Saudi Arabia in Washington, elsewhere, that Mohammed bin Salman is young, he's untested, he has engaged in a variety of policies that from the outside don't seem to have been successful or accrued to the benefit of Saudi Arabia. You know him, you've spent much of your career working on Saudi Arabia. Do you see Saudi stability in jeopardy for his rule?
No. Short answer. The issue of Mohammed bin Salman is a highly emotional one. The death, the grotesque, unjustified, terrible death of murder of Jamal Khashoggi has stained the image of Mohammed bin Salman in the West, a very promising image. The detention of women and men accused of security crimes and going through the Saudi security course, but is portrayed in the West as solely because of dissent, has again stained that reputation. But if you step away from that, and again, in my old business and in looking at the region, you step away from the emotion, look at just the facts. Is the country falling apart? No. Is the economy moving forward? Yes. Are they moving away from oil? Yes. Are women empowered increasingly for the first time in the country's history? Well, second time maybe. Yes. Is this going to be a glorious and easy success? Absolutely not. Is it going to get there on the schedule they've put forward, with the level of success they've put forward? I can't imagine that being the case, only because no government has ever achieved that. But if your definition of stability is, will the economy succeed? Will Islam be moderated from Saudi Arabia? Will women play a larger role in the kingdom? Will the economy diversify itself from oil? And is this process maybe too late to stop? I think the answer is yes, that's all happening. And I'll close by saying when we think about the stability of Saudi Arabia, what's important to us, I don't look at it in terms of weapons. I don't really look at it in terms of oil. I look at it in terms of the aspirational benefits. We want the people who dominate Islam because of Mecca and Medina to propagate a normative, moderate Islam which pushes against extremism and terrorism throughout the world. We want women's rights protected throughout the world. We want oil to be something in the past, I think, and people to move into a different area. When I look at the Middle East of the Emirates or Saudi Arabia, I'm looking for the diversity, for their ideas. I'm looking for what they bring to the world. I'm not just looking for a barrel of oil. Under Mohammed bin Salman, with the issues of Jamal Khashoggi's cruel murder and the detention of the women and men in Saudi Arabia out there, all those are being achieved. May not be on the schedule we like, but the answer is yes, it's stable.
Great, thank you. We're now open to the floor. If you'd like to ask a question, I think there's a microphone running around here. Right here on the end. I'll get to you guys in the middle. We'll move across the room.
The General Assembly of the United Nations passed a resolution calling for the establishment of a Middle East zone free of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. The first convening of that will be November 18th through 22nd of this year. What do you predict is going to happen at that conference, given that in order to get the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty extended in 1995, pursuit of a nuclear weapons-free zone was a key promise to get the indefinite extension of the NPT. And there is enormous pressure now on the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, a terrible thing for it to fray and have a cascade of proliferation in that region. So what do you think is going to happen at this conference?
Ambassador Nusseibeh. Well, it's the UN.
I'm joking.
That's where you.
Thank you for the question. And, I think the premise of the question, which is that the NPT remains a fundamental treaty that safeguards all of our peace and security, remains. And I think it is a high priority, and that is the perception of the majority of member states towards the NPT. I think this convening of this conference is a step change. It's a step forward. It's been years of negotiating the format and the procedural rules and how we'll convene and who will participate as multilateral organizations go. This has been a relatively long process, so that is saying something. I just recently attended the first consultative meeting amongst attendees of the conference to discuss the agenda, and it's being ably chaired by Jordan. And the good news is that Iran, for example, has agreed to be at the table, and I think that's important. Israel, on the other hand, has not, and I think that's a shame for the conference and our ability to discuss a proper regional framework, because it is eventually going to have to include Israel in the security architecture once there is a two-state solution in place and Palestinian aspirations have been realized. But in terms of nuclear proliferation, I think it's clear that this is a priority. I think this conference, again, like other processes at the UN, is an important step to get these countries around the table to start talking things through. Because it's the UN, the agenda has yet to be debated, the rules of procedures are being decided as we speak, and so forth. But I'm happy to say that this is happening, and I think countries are taking a positive approach towards it as a first step.
We had some questions right here in the middle. Right here.
Ambassador Ross, the Strait of Hormuz, that area right now is considered international waters, but do you have fear that Iran might practice aggression and try to take over that area, whether it is by charging tolls on tankers going through? And if that does happen, I'm sure there would be a huge international community response to that area, but what is the underlying reason why Iran would do that? And then for Ambassador Nusseibeh...
Well, we got to do one question at a time because
sure.
we're running in time.
Could you repeat the question?
So I didn't quite, the essence of that question was,
Will Iran take over the Straits of Hormuz?
will Iran take over the Straits of Hormuz?
And if they do, why would you think they would want to do that?
Look, I think we're, let's put it this way. I think if Iran takes over the Straits of Hormuz, we're living in a different planet. It was, at least until this administration, the policy of the United States through Republican and Democratic administrations was no hostile power should gain leverage over the oil supply, the flow of energy, and so forth. I say until this administration because President Trump said we don't get our oil from there, others do, so they need to assume the principal responsibility. He didn't say we wouldn't play any role, but he said we wouldn't play the main role. And that was a reversal, really, of the, if nothing else, of the Jimmy Carter establishing in January 1980 that this was an area of vital security interest to the United States. I would hope that there would be a kind of collective response. Maybe the U.S. plays a role in that. It's hard to believe there won't be a collective response without the United States. But I don't think we can afford to somehow cede whether what flows through the Strait of Hormuz is determined by the Iranians. I can't imagine many things that wouldn't be more threatening, ultimately, and I think sooner or later will produce a conflict. One thing I just want to pick up on something that Norm said earlier. You know, in my mind, the greatest danger of a conflict right now is the Iranians overplaying their hand, thinking that, in fact, there won't be a response. And I would hope that they realize that if they overplay their hand, the consequences for them could be quite bad.
Gentleman right here in the white shirt.
It's a question to Dennis Ross. By the way, the Human Factor movie was great. The documentary in Hampton Film Festival that I saw about Middle East negotiation. But back to the question. If you think it will be in Israel a unity government and they will resume a real peace negotiation, do you think the Hamas will be accepted to the table, or it will be just between Israeli and the Palestinian Authority?
Yeah, I don't see, I don't see the new Israeli government being any more willing to deal directly with Hamas, which is not to say that there isn't a kind of indirect relationship. Clearly, when the Israeli government allows Qatar to bring money to Hamas, obviously they're exceeding or acquiescing in something because they think it prevents a blow-up. I don't think either the Israelis or Hamas wants a blow-up because they both are likely to lose from that. The price for Hamas could be actually catastrophic, but the price for the Israelis is not only physically a high price and potentially internationally a high price, but also if you decapitate Hamas, you're then stuck in Gaza. And I don't think the Israelis want to be stuck in Gaza. So the real question is, you know, what can you do to try to make things more stable? You know, when 96% of the water in Gaza is undrinkable, when electricity today is now up to 16 hours a day, up from 4, when there still is shortages of electricity in terms of being able to power sewage treatment plants, when 50% of the population is unemployed and 70% of those between the ages of 18 and 29 are unemployed, that's a really combustible mix. And if you want to hear the people who are most certain to make the case that something needs to be done, it's the IDF. So I think, you know, there is a plan that actually has been put together by Nikolai Mlodinov, who is a quite effective coordinator on the peace issue for the UN, that would at least stabilize, create kind of a floor in Gaza. I suspect you'll find an Israeli government that will be open to that. And it would be good if the Trump administration itself was prepared not only to be open to it, but to be more supportive of it.
We are really running out of time, so I want to apologize to those who still have their hands up. We could have been here for another 45 minutes or another 4 hours, but some of us actually have to get on a train and go back to DC. So please join me in thanking Norman Roule, Ambassador Ross, and Ambassador Nusseibeh. Thank you very much.